All right. So if we settle a case, great. Strains and stresses all around are alleviated, but we know that not every case does settle, not every case can settle, and sometimes we know that not every case should settle. But are these cases that we don't settle, should we think of them as failures? As a mediator, we're not actually in a numbers game. Settlements are great, but we can't be defined by them at the expense of the real value that we provide to parties. And I think it's very important that the parties realise, going through the mediation as well as towards the end of a mediation that can't settle, that there is a value just by being there, just having shown up for the process and having talked their case through. I've been a mediator now, but I've been a lawyer going through mediations on behalf of clients, and I've been a party to mediation too. Many of those cases didn't settle in mediation, but did settle before they got to court. And it was my absolute experience time and time again that it was the mediation process itself, the preparing for it, the showing up, the going through the process, perhaps walking away angrily thinking that didn't work or didn't happen or whatever. But it was that was actually a stepping stone on the way to a settlement that couldn't have been achieved without the mediation. Whether the case settles or not within the mediation, it's important to think about the things that are really valuable. In particular, in the cases that we do, where we have quite often with people that aren't represented, with people that haven't been through the court system ever, possibly, and more likely actually they haven't been through a mediation system, to know, for them to understand what the value of the process is very important. From a lawyer's point of view and from a party's point of view, I can say that the value that in any mediation is that you get a really clear view of what the parties might bring if you have to go to court. You're going to understand what the other side's strategy is. You might not have known that before. You might have been ready to show up to court with 10 fantastic arguments, all of which you might win, but in fact, the other side is coming up with 10 very different arguments that are more relevant. Wouldn't you love to know that before you get to court and realise that your preparation's all been in vain? You'll get a view of your weaknesses. Perhaps you haven't brought, perhaps you don't have quite enough evidence. Perhaps your arguments aren't quite on point. In mediation, you might realise that you've got a good argument, you've got good grounds for complaint, but there is valid explanations, or there are things that can happen naturally, or there are things that will happen before you get to court. That means your complaint's not going to be relevant by the time you get to court. Possibly, you'll find out that you've brought a claim against a couple of parties, but one of those parties isn't relevant, or one of your claims isn't relevant. And if you go to court not realising that, you possibly might face a sanction for having brought something that shouldn't be there and having, ostensibly wasted the court's time and the other side's time. But you're also going to get a view of your own strengths, possibly by presenting them and possibly by seeing what the other side's weaknesses are. Perhaps in mediation, you can flush out some of the facts that you weren't previously fully appreciative of. Perhaps there's something that the other side hasn't fully appreciated. And as a lawyer, certainly going through a mediation, it can be very helpful to realise that something that your client thought was just a really, really valid, important point, when it comes to when they're actually standing there, sitting there talking about it, you realise that it might have the weaknesses that you really wouldn't want to have. And it's so important to know these weaknesses before you get in front of a sheriff who's going to decide one way or another and is looking for weaknesses on either side anyway. There's also the opportunity to do some reality checking. Okay, so the case isn't going to settle. You're going to go to court. Do you understand what the court process is going to be like? Do you understand that when you go to court, you're going to have evidence, you're going to have witnesses, you're going to have a period of time set aside to speak about your case. You're going to have to think about how nervous you might be. You're going to have to think about other factors. For example, how are you going to get there? How long is it going to take? Are you going to take time off work? These are all the things that can be flushed out and thought about in mediation as well. in terms of also of what the court process is going to be like, I suppose from all of this, the point of it is that if you're going to go through a mediation that doesn't settle, just this information that you're going to get on the way, if you think of the mediation as being a stepping stone instead of a solution, it's incredibly valuable to know that, okay, it's not going to settle, you're going to go to court. However, you're extremely prepared now to go to court. And when you think about it, our cases are all in simplified procedure for less than £5,000. They are free at the point of service. And if you do a mediation, it's usually over Zoom. It's only 3 hours. It's very limited in terms of the cost of time and money. There's kind of little to argue against it from that point of view. Bigger cases, particularly ones in which lawyers are involved, are far more complicated in terms of mediation. They cost a lot more money and they take a lot more time and preparation. So if we can provide a service like this that is very cost effective for the parties and gives them this kind of sort of particular view of what court might be like, then we're providing an extremely valuable service to them. I suppose the main point of it is if a case doesn't settle and you're going to have to go to court, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. You're there now, you've got a really clear view of what's going to happen at court. But also there's a possibility of, just because the case doesn't settle in that particular mediation, doesn't mean to say that it's not going to settle before you get to court. You know, you might have loosened things up a bit for the parties. They might be, you know, a bit emotional or a bit angry in the mediation. Maybe when the frost settles a little bit, they're going to have a chance to think about what's been said in the mediation, particularly about what court might look like. You know, a couple of thoughts might have lodged in their minds. The strengths and the weaknesses and the reality of the situation might have lodged in their mind a little bit. You know, so perhaps there's a chance that they're going to be able to continue talking to each other, or even they get to court and they know that there's still a possibility to settle on the courthouse steps. I suppose in all of this, then, what is very important as mediators is to allow the parties the idea of keeping an open mind. A case doesn't settle, then, you know, it's good to point out to them, not every case does settle at mediation. Not every mediation is the final point either, though. Perhaps in your mediation, there might be an opportunity to bring them back for another mediation. There might not be. That's not always the most practical solution. But there may be, because these channels of communication have been open, there may be ways where they can communicate with each other before they get to court. But again, the worst case scenario isn't really all that bad. If they get to court, okay, that's where they were headed anyway, but they have the benefit from mediation of being forewarned and therefore forearmed. So I think whenever I end a mediation that hasn't settled, I try and go over some of these points with the parties. But one of the things I definitely see, and I say it, you know, in pre-mediation as well, is that mediation is a chance for you to get your say. If you stand up in front of a sheriff, you might not be able to get to say the things you want. It might be because the sheriff isn't really willing to listen. It might be because there's not time. It might be because you've become so nervous and your adrenaline boost isn't helping you. Within the mediation, though, you've had a chance, or you're getting a chance to flush out the things that really annoy you or really make you angry, or the things that you just really want to say. And I think throughout the mediation process, it's important to, you know, remind the parties, you know, this is your chance to be really heard. You might not get that chance in court, so do it now. You know, get everything you want to say on the table, and it's confidential. Everything that you say here is confidential. But again, if I end a mediation that hasn't settled, I always remind them that it's not the end. There's always a chance to settle. There's also, I mean, there's some cases that go to a jury trial and render a verdict, still settle after that in a way that the jury hasn't decided on. There is always a chance to settle. And I think getting that straight in the parties' minds is really, really beneficial. So I'm going to end there. And I think if we can go into little groups now and, you know, have a chat about, you know, cases that haven't settled, maybe hear some input. Charlie's going to help with breakout rooms online.
Breakout room. What they see to the
Yep.
want to say that?
All right. Okay. Okay.
give us
So
that.
when we go into these groups, you just give me another wee minute, guys. When we go into these groups, I think if we could just have a thought about what we're going to say
Whoa.
in terms of.
Elise has an instruction.
I've been instructed to have an instruction. So we go into these breakout groups, so we can have a think about what we say to the parties as a mediation that hasn't settled. How do we shore up the positives?
Okay. I'll open the breakout rooms online. You should be getting an invitation in the next few seconds. So if you could join the room and about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, 10 minutes, yeah. Okay, it's not happening. Okay.
I'll pause the recording.
Have second and third, and therefore be in a position to settle in between that time and the proof time or at the door of the court.
Okay, thank you for that. So it's the benefit of like a dress rehearsal for what you might be saying in front of a sheriff, of being able to flush out what your thoughts are and how many of them really stand up when you actually hear yourself say them. Yep, thanks for that. So somebody online, any volunteers?
Chatting.
Elise, I think one of the points you made was very powerful, but this presumption that parties have that if they get back into the court process, they're actually going to be allowed to speak. Of course, it's not always the case in the simple procedure. The sheriff's going to allow them to speak and say as much as they want to speak. And in our breakout room, there was a sense that that is a very important point, as it is to encourage parties to continue speaking even though on the mediation day resolution is not achieved. I was speaking to a company this morning, the litigation department in the company this morning, where a mediation yesterday did not achieve a resolution. And I was really inviting the claimant to perhaps continue a dialogue with the respondent. My conversation failed because the litigation lady explained that actually the respondent had been seriously abusive of her colleagues, and that had completely put her back up. So in fact, that would go nowhere and that will return to court. It was an English litigation department, and one of the learning lessons from them, they were very complimentary about the mediation process and how it's conducted, but they had virtually no understanding about the capping of legal expense in Scotland. And so there was a lot of learning lessons for them as a litigation department on what goes up here. I know obviously the discretion of the sheriff, ultimately he can go above and beyond the cap, but there was a learning experience there for them, even in a situation where no resolution was achieved yesterday.
Okay, right. Thanks for that, Sandy. So I suppose, yes, it's always worth pointing out to the parties that, you know, they've had their chance to speak, and if they're in front of a sheriff, they might not get a chance to speak at all. Did everyone hear that? Can you hear from here? Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you, Sandy. Nice to see you again. Anyone in the room ready to another example?
Yeah, we were talking, one of the things that Patrick had used was to do a final recap summary, just with the parties in the room, saying it's not settled, this was what you were saying, this is what you were saying, and as a result X, and actually that precipitated a settlement on the day, because suddenly they realized what the implication of it was. But even so, doing that seemed to be a good thing, along with the thank you. I don't know about anyone else, I always try and say thank you to the parties for participating, whether it's settled or not. Might be through gritted teeth if you actually think they've not really been participating, but I think it's a sort of polite thing to leave on a positive if you can. So the idea of bringing people back together, although again, Patrick had a good example where somebody had made a final offer and then had to leave, so couldn't come back to the final joint session. And as a result, Patrick had to relay that back to the other party, who then, on the basis that the other party had left, and that was genuinely a final offer, said, okay, I'll take it. So sometimes those little things can make a difference right at the end when you're not expecting.
Okay, okay, thanks. I don't know if people heard that online. You did, okay, great. So yeah, so I think, yeah, some really good points. They're doing a recap of everything that's been said, including the pluses of what's left undone. And yeah, a really good point is a thank you. I think it's really important to, you know, acknowledge and appreciate that the parties have made this big effort, even if it's not worked out fully positively. It's still a massive effort, which in itself is a massive step towards some kind of resolution. So thank you for that. Is there somebody else online ready to give an example or talk about what they can't actually see everyone? Hold on. Okay, any volunteers? All right. we'll
Hello?
pass-
Oh, hello. I
Hello.
was just wondering, after your first answer, do solicitors actually advise clients that they may not get the chance to speak in court? How much do solicitors say before a mediation becomes litigation?
That's a good question. I'm not terribly sure. Anyone, any idea, anyone know how to answer that question? How much would a solicitor tell the client that of the chances they're going to get to speak in court?
I think that would
But-
be the solicitor would, you know, that there's no, I don't think there's any prescribed
Yeah,
sort of format you'd follow, depends on the person.
yeah, that's probably fair.
Sorry, I didn't get you, Patrick.
Okay,
Yes.
so basically, as Patrick says, it probably varies from solicitor to solicitor. You know, it's the lawyer's answer of it depends, I suppose.
Right.
This came up in our room actually, to just say I'm both a lawyer and a mediator, and I always tell my clients the difference and say that you get this opportunity in mediation to say what you want, but in court you won't get anything like that, and particularly the cases I deal with are in the court session typically. So I think it's really worth spelling out the difference and the opportunity in mediation versus court. And I think most of the solicitors I know would do that as well, because it just highlights the benefits of mediation and encourages the party to take the opportunity while they have it.
Okay, so do you, what do you tell your clients if a mediation hasn't settled? How do you approach that with them? Do some of them think you've wasted time, or?
Well, do you know, we were in our group, we were saying that there's always a couple of themes came out, but one that you've always gathered some sort of information, whether it's more about the commercial drivers that might lead to settlement, or whether it's just the reality of your case, their case. There's always something that's useful. And I always tell them that it was worth the try, even the ones where there hasn't been so much that you can say, well, you got this or this out of it, then it was worth a try for the potential of settlement and the time and money and, you know, relationship damage that could have been saved. And then it's maybe quite a comfort that then if they do have to go into court, well, then they've tried their best to avoid it.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, that they've done everything to avoid court, even if it hasn't actually been successful. Is there one more group in the room that we haven't heard from? Oh, yeah.
We're talking
Alan.
about a few things, but one of the things I was saying was that there is a slight danger, I think, with the instinct of trying to sell mediation as an opportunity, so therefore sort of almost casting, I think Leon said, is like court is like this bogeyman, this threat in the background. Because if you get to a point where it isn't going to set and they're going to court, you might have set up court as being a horrendous experience. So then the idea of trying to tell it is, well, do mediate, the mediation was an opportunity. This is court. Court's an opportunity to tell you, to maybe not tell your story in the same way, but to have the evidence looked at, to have a judgment to get this finished. But you can't do that if you've spent 3 hours trying to convince them that court will be horrible, so settle here today, please. And I think there is an instinct sometimes to do that, to make court seem horrible, so that you get the best out of the mediation. But yeah, that brings some awkwardness when you're like, oh, well, court now, bye.
Yeah, that's a very good point, isn't it? How much can we, how do we set the expectations, knowing that the mediation actually might not settle? So I think we've got, is there one group to hear from? Right, Sandy?
No, I just wanted to remind people, following upon what was just said by the immediately previous speaker, there is the opportunity for all volunteers to observe case management discussions online. And I think that is a very valuable learning experience for anyone who's not done it before, just to see how the system operates, how the sheriff conducts that CMD, that case management discussion. Now, I'm not saying that's the same as an evidential hearing at all, but it does give you a feel for how cases are handled at the simple procedure level. It is very much a process-driven session where 15 cases will be put through the mill inside a couple of hours. And the sheriffs can be quite robust with parties, and I'd encourage volunteers to observe that, just to see how, how the courts operate. Getting evidential hearings, they're a very rare commodity because of the pressure in the system. They're very reluctant to give even a half-day evidential hearing. So while I accept what the previous speaker said, and we don't want to say the court system is something that's going to be avoided at all cost, I think a kind of reality check, and for us as mediators to have an appreciation of what that system is useful. So if anyone hasn't already observed a CMD, they'd like to do so in Edinburgh Sheriff Court on a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, drop me an email. I can put you in touch with the people who can organise an invite to you by way of WebEx meeting.
Right, thank you for that, Sandy. I think it's also worth pointing out that for some people, when they find themselves in court, it's actually quite a positive experience. I mean, typically that only really applies to the side that's won, but so maybe it's not all bad. Is there anyone else online that wants to say anything about when a mediation doesn't settle? Right, there we go. Yeah, Oyen Crow.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, we assume that the disputants want to settle the matter, but what if they come to mediation because they were obliged to come for mediation? The sheriff, they were directed to go for mediation, not because they were particularly keen or excited about going for mediation. And even when they eventually ended up in mediation, they had already set up blockers. I mean, 1 or 2 blockers that would inhibit settlement. There isn't much the mediator can do about that. I mean, you have used all your skills, you've engaged as appropriate, and then they don't mind going back to the sheriff court for litigation. And again, I mean, some persons, we've also been told that some cases are best managed via litigation. So they might just want to go for litigation. What do we do in instances like that? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's kind of, an interesting point just to wrap up on. There's always a chance that there's, one party just doesn't want to be there. It's always good practice when you're, first connecting with parties to remind them it's a voluntary process. It's always going to be a voluntary process. But hopefully even, particularly with a party that doesn't want to be there, if they do show up, then we can certainly make it a positive experience for them. And if it doesn't settle, to reinforce, just as, we've been talking about, what has been positive about it. And maybe that might change their mind going forward.